Yeah, my brother's doing a residency program in Muncie, Indiana. So we've gotten a little bit up in your neck of the woods, but not full
I,
time South Bend, other than a quick visit here and there.
again, it's not my neck of the woods; it's the neck of the woods where I am. Uh, my neck of the woods is along the shores of the Chesapeake Bay.
Okay, very good. That's an important distinction. Um,
Well, yes, I like to think so. So,
yeah, yeah. Well, before we get started with the kind of official context of the interview, I just wanted to say a quick personal thank you. Your work has just proved so important to me. I grew up in kind of a fundamentalist tradition of Christianity, if dare
right.
to call it that, and it just as my kind of intellectual life was becoming fuller, and I realized the ways in which that wasn't going to work. I just felt so much permission that there's something deeper in the Christian tradition, and getting beyond theistic personalism and all that is actually truer to the tradition than what I'd grown up with in many ways. So your work really made that open to me, and it's made all the difference in the world. And so just wanted to say a quick thank you on that part. And just I hope you hear that affirmation that your work is spiritually edifying for a lot of people, and in addition to just being well written and all that, it
I'm
does.
just in it for the money.
That's right. That's right.
You
That's right.
know, the big bucks.
That's right. Mercenary writer. Yeah, very good. I used the introduction that was in the jacket on You Are Gods to kind of introduce you to the audience for the Christian century. Is that the one you would like me to use, or I can?
I don't have any idea what it says, so so yes, that's
Good.
the one. I love it.
Okay. And then in the end, I'll ask you what other books or things you'd like to talk about. Feel free to pitch as broadly. I know you're working on something with the philosophy of mind, and that in March, the new edition of your New Testament translation is coming out. So we'll make reference to those. So I'll kind of imagine a start here. Hello, and welcome to the Christian Century Magazine interview series. I'm here today with David Bentley Hart, who's an Eastern Orthodox scholar of religion and a philosopher, writer, and cultural commentator. He's the author and translator of over 21 books, including the award-winning Theological Territories, the David Bentley Hart Digest, and that's out from University of Notre Dame Press in 2020. And David, you've written so much else in the meantime, and we'll get into a little bit of that. But first off, I just wanted to say a big thank you. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Well, thanks for having me along.
Great.
Having me over, or whatever one says when one's on Zoom.
Exactly. And it's kind of
thanks
similar.
thanks for sending your pixels my way and receiving mine at your end.
Anytime, anytime. So I just wanted to acknowledge we've already run a review of Tradition and Apocalypse that just came out online about 6 days ago. So our readers are going to get a chance to hear and read a little bit more about that elsewhere. So my hope was that we could spend a little more time in this interview talking about the other book you released this past year, You Are Gods, and then also your new edition of the New Testament translation that's going to be released in March with Yale. So let's start with You Are Gods. It's a collection of essays that essentially argues against any distinction between nature and supernature in Christian theology, if I've understood it correctly.
Yeah.
And in it, you say that any coherent metaphysics ultimately is a monism. I wonder, would you be willing to speak a little more to the main arguments of the book and what you're trying to accomplish with it?
Well, it can get a little recherche pretty quickly. I'll try to make it simple enough. In one sense, the book, though it's written in a provocative way and draws on traditions that aren't always drawn on by, well, very rarely used by Christians, like Vedantic tradition. At the heart of it is an affirmation of Eastern patristic and, I would say, broadly mainstream Christian metaphysics. The precipitating occasion has been the revival in recent years of a tradition in Catholic thought that many of us had thought dead and buried, and happily dead and buried, fortunately dead, unfortunately, we neglected to drive a stake through its heart, apparently. This is a tradition that sometimes opprobriously, I mean, when people are trying to be dismissive of it, they call it two-tier Thomism, which is why I choose to call it two-tier Thomism. It's sort of an early modern school that, in order to affirm the gratuity of God's goodness, created a kind of absolute distinction between the natural and supernatural ends of rational creatures, and came to assert that spiritual beings are so entirely undeserving of grace, as you could put it that way, or so incapable of meriting or rising to the grace that God may or may not elect to give them, that in their own natures they don't even have the divine, the supernatural knowledge of God as their proper end. That's considered purely as natural beings. Their intellects and wills and spirits could rest wholly content in a natural end. They might be curious about God in a kind of ideological sense. They might, be moved to wonder where the world came from. So they might be curious about God as an explanatory principle, but purely as natural beings, they would not have this insatiable longing that Augustine describes as the cor inquietum, the unquiet heart. Our hearts are restless till they rest in you, right? Now, there are any number of problems with this. One is that it simply is a rejection of basically the whole Christian tradition on what a spiritual being is, but also it's philosophically impossible at two ends. One is that any coherent consideration of what a rational nature is requires that all of its desires and wills occur within the context of a consuming rational desire for the good, the true, the beautiful. Otherwise, nothing would prompt the rational will into action. But that desire then is also, because the transcendentals, the good, the true, the beautiful, one being, whatever, are nothing but names for the essence of God. And that every Christian understanding of a rational nature, other than this bizarre modern version of Thomism, have affirmed this. The other is that it creates a logical or modal or metaphysical impossibility. That is, it says that when God superadds grace to our natures, it transforms, it deifies us, transforms us into beings at once natural and supernatural, though there is no premise either in faculty or potency for the supernatural in us, because otherwise our natural end would be supernatural and God would sort of owe us grace according to this way of thinking. So the problem is that means that if we're transformed into something for which we have neither the potency nor the faculty, then we're not actually transformed. We're annihilated in our natural essence and replaced with something else. The way that the traditionalist Thomist, and I'm finishing up now, school got around this paradox was to say that there's something called an obediential potency, a potentia obedientialis in us, that allows us to be supplemented by something beyond our nature. But again, this is a gross abuse of the very notion of obediential potential. It's a misuse of an earlier concept. The earlier concept was that an obediential potential was a way in which a natural potential in us that was still continuous with who and what we were as natural beings was dormant due to accidental conditions. For instance, a woman is unable to give birth to children past her fertile years, right? So Sarah could not have a child for Abraham well into her dotage, but that God could miraculously educe that potency for which we've lost the faculty. In this way of thinking, there are potencies and there are faculties. Faculty is the power to realize or actualize a potency, right?
Mm-hmm.
That God could miraculously intervene in such a way that he would make that potency active again. This would not violate our nature. It would be miraculous, but it wouldn't violate our natures. That's what what an obediential potential was originally. The way it was misused in this tradition was to suggest that somehow magically the potential this potency was one unattached either to any natural potency or a faculty in us, but was just some sort of weird plasticity of our nature that somehow could be exploited by God to make us into something to which we had absolutely no inchoate natural predisposition without fundamentally altering our natures. This is gibberish. It's logical rubbish. But it's also, I'll let you go on to the next question, it's also just a hideous picture of reality, because the whole point of maintaining this ridiculous division is to suggest that grace is so thoroughly gratuitous that it doesn't constitute any injustice on God's part to withhold beatitude from any rational nature if he should so elect to do so.
To the point where Thomas, I think, imagines cheering as God damns people, if my memory serves correctly.
Thomas imagines what?
Cheering as God damns people, if I remember correctly.
Well, there is this, yes, the damnation, the torments of the damned will increase the beatitude of the blessed in heaven, according to Thomas. He's following here Peter Lombard. Mm. And, of course, the defense for this claim that you often hear from Thomas is, well, what he means not that you're taking intrinsic delight in their suffering, you're simply delighting in the contrast between your state and theirs. But of course, that's precisely what it is, to delight in the sufferings of others. It's the sadistic pleasure of being immune to the suffering of those you see suffering.
Right.
But this is why I do happen to believe that Thomism is, the school of Thomism. I don't mean the study of Thomas Aquinas. I mean this faction that begins in the 16th century especially, but does have roots in Thomas's own thought, selectively and synthetically, but really too, the sort of Thomism should be regarded as a psychopathology that needs pity and pharmacological adjustment.
Healing, I guess.
Healing, but healing in a strictly controlled clinical condition, situation.
Yeah, fair enough. So not to jump too many steps down the line of argument then, but does this essentially amount to something like a kind of Trinitarian pantheism, or is it closer to this picture of Exodus and Reditus that other thinkers highlight in the early?
Well, the word pantheism is one of the great meaningless terms in metaphysical history. It's usually used as a term of abuse vaguely. And since it doesn't have a meaning, I don't use it. I find it neither a word to be avoided nor a word to be embraced. But at the end of the day, it most definitely, and here, I'm firmly in a tradition that includes not just the Cappadocian fathers, but the Pseudo-Dionysius, Maximus the Confessor, most definitely, but also, chancy figures like John Scotus Erigena, pronounce it however you like, the Rhineland mystics, Nicholas of Cusa, and of course the greatest theologian of the late modern age, Sergei Bulgakov, and saying there must be in any metaphysics ultimately a monism. There has to be one principle of all. And that, yes, the natural and the supernatural are not really two different orders of It's not the orders of nature and grace. In fact, we should talk about nature and grace in a moment, but because we want to talk about my translation of the New Testament too. You said, right?
That's right.
But two different, two discrete orders. Rather, the nature and supernature are one and the same thing as viewed from different perspectives. And there's no final dividing line between them. And in fact, the word supernature, really is a kind of late intrusion upon Christian discourse. It doesn't appear until, I think, Philip the Chancellor. And Thomas Aquinas uses it very sparingly. And all it means there, it's not talking about a different order over and above nature as such. It's only used to mean something in excess of the nature of a particular creature. So it would be supernaturum for me to be an incorporeal intelligence capable of moving at angelic speed from one end of the cosmos to the other, Not that I believe in incorporeal.
Sure.
Different issue. But that's all it means. It's not, the notion of the supernatural as an altogether discrete order of being is a very, very late and unwelcome intruder on Christian intellectual tradition. It has no presence in the Eastern tradition, and a very, very late presence, early modern actually, in the Western tradition. And the great critique of this sort of two-tier Thomism, even as it was reaching its brief period of dominance in the Catholic Church, was Henri de Lubac's book, Sur Naturel, which has never been translated into English. The first edition, a later book called The Mystery of the Supernatural, which is far inferior, has been. But even before then, there were critics like I think the greatest Catholic philosopher of the 19th and 20th century period, all told, Maurice Blondel. So the very notion of the supernatural in that sense is very much alien to scriptural and patristic and early medieval thought.
Yeah, that's a helpful frame of reference. And part of, I guess, what my question with that is what distinction do you think that makes for Christian theology, or just practically for the internal logic of Christian faith?
Well, it helps break down a number of false divisions that are pernicious in themselves, some of which are older than this division. The division between the supernatural and the natural is sort of a late metastasis of an artificial distinction between nature and grace, which I'll return to again, as I said. But one is that the very notion that there's such a thing as a spiritual nature that's anything other than, as Blondel would put it, an insatiable hunger for God, clearly is one that doesn't make sense within Christian tradition for reasons I've already mentioned, and for any number of others. It's certainly not the view that was taken by patristic tradition and its sequels. Also, there's an arbitrariness then in the Thomistic system that exceeds, that's just as bad as the late Augustine at his worst, as Jansenism, Aquinas at his worst, too, I have to admit, were the worst aspects of Calvinism, in which, since the superimposition, or rather the super addition, I should say, of something called the lumen gloriae to the human spirit, which allows it to perceive the divine in itself, this purely gratuitous act of the super elevation of the creature out of its nature into a supernatural condition of deification, has absolutely no premise in the nature of the creature. None. So it's not just that God arbitrarily elects some to save and leaves others to their supposedly condign combustion forever and ever and ever. It's that the act itself is a discontinuity in the image of God in us, and a purely arbitrary act in every sense, one that does not, despite the claim that grace perfects rather than abolishes nature, does not perfect our nature. It creates a second nature and dissevers the entirety of creation from the supernatural order. Now, this is completely in keeping with Thomist eschatology, I'll admit, because, as you know, the biblical eschatology is of the apokatastasis ton panton, or tikkun olam, the reconstitution of creation. It's not simply the noetic state of a redeemed spirit, but an entire creation that includes the mineral, the vegetable, the animal dimensions, and the restoration of a kind of mediatorial presence of the human in creation. That's the biblical view. That's the patristic view. Mm. The Thomist eschatology actually is of the final annihilation of physical creation, and for some reason a resurrection, and that actually at that point seems to be a rather odious thing, except that in Thomism, being strictly hylomorphic, we couldn't exist as individual human beings without the soul impressing the form of the body on a real material substrate of some kind. And it's a rather disgusting view of reality. It's that all of creation, most of creation, is destined for one of two ends: annihilation or eternal torment. Mm-hmm. And a small artificial distillate, which has violently been deprived of its own nature and given a different nature in its stead, will enjoy eternal beatitude, and be so utterly altered from what it was in this world that small company of the blessed will actually be able to take delight from the sufferings of the damned, even the damned among those they loved in this life. It's a psychotic picture of reality. I mean, the book is aimed not just against metaphysics, it's aimed against a religion that I regard as morally inferior to Satanism. Right. In fact, a religion that actually makes Satanism admirable, because Satanism would then be a revolt against an evil God. Yeah. So I don't take it to be just as I said, recherche at the beginning, I don't take it to be just a small metaphysical issue.
Mm-hmm. Right. And that's really helpful. And I'm going a little out of order, but one thing that brings to mind is in your previous book, That All Should Be Saved, I think you do make this case compellingly, and I think decisively, that the only faithful logical claim for Christian eschatology actually is universal salvation. And I was interested because at a face level, it seems to come into tension somewhat, or maybe it's because I'm misunderstanding, but with this claim that the ultimate destiny of everything is to become finally uncreated. Yeah.
Well, that's Maximus the Confessor, yeah.
Absolutely. And Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa and, others as well. But so I take it to be something that's only on its face intention. Could you help us understand the?
Why would it be intention? I'm actually not following what the tension is.
Or maybe a better way to ask is, could you help us understand what would it mean for something to ultimately become uncreated? Because I think to many readers that's going to sound like annihilation or something like that. But I think you're making
oh no, just the opposite. I mean, God is uncreated, and He's hardly nothingness.
Exactly. So it's actually to enter more fully back into the divine life. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I mean, you know, for, say, Maximus or Nicholas or something, or any of those, as I say, who have this healthy view that don't artificially separate the supernatural from the natural. You know, God creates not, I mean, it's not, he's not like some discrete being who has fabricated an artifact of will outside himself. You know, it's in him we live and move and have our being. And the whole purpose of creation is the calling into being from nothingness of creatures to enter into the infinity of God directly and be perfectly united in the Logos, in Christ with him. So, you know, just as the patristic formula is that God became a man that human beings might become God, and with a G, and you know, don't be a capital G. You don't have to say, you don't have to try to mollify the shockingness of that language, or emoliate, or whatever the hell the word was. Putting this.
Soften the blow. There's no softening of the blow.
But for Maximus, you'll just say, or the uncreated became created, that the created might become uncreated. I mean, it's just absolutely, utterly pervaded by the divine nature, and understand that everything that exists in the Logos, every Logos within the Logos, every little Logos of everything is itself a modality of the divine presence. So even in our difference from God, at the ground of our being, and you find this in Eckhart, and of course the Rhineland mystics as well, and Nicholas and Bulgakov, is God being God in that which is in an otherness, you know. But, and this, I love Nicholas's terms, while each of us is something other than God, an aliud in some sense, God is the non-aliud, the not other. He's not a thing over against us. He is that in which we live and move and have our being, and the one who in us makes us who we are. And so to become uncreated means to become God. You know, now that in every theistic tradition that has such language, and here, that's one of the reasons it's helpful to shift and use Vedantic terminology, is that there's a clear distinction between, say, Advaita and Vishishtadvaita Vedanta, in which, you know, one emphasizes the union, the other, though, emphasizes the union with in a relationship of love that's somehow eternal. Mm-hmm. You know, in Christian tradition, obviously, they're not talking about the annihilation of personality, but the fulfillment of personality in each of us in becoming utterly transparent to the Logos that's the ground of our own personalities. Mm-hmm. Think of it this way. One way of understanding Jesus as the incarnate Son of God is to say, is as Maximus says, in most human beings, there is the natural will. Right? In all human beings, there's the natural will, in all rational creatures, which means that in us which spontaneously desires only God and chooses only God, because that's its true end. To the degree that we're separate from God, though, or we have a deliberative or gnomic will, which is a sort of a psychological will that can make errors and go in the wrong direction and do sinful things. Jesus, according to Maximus, doesn't have a gnomic will, not because he doesn't have the capacity for deliberation, but because he's so perfectly, fully, truly one with the Father and is himself the Son, that there's no division between who he is essentially and who he is psychologically and empirically, right? There's you know, no space of separation. Human beings are called to become like that, utterly transparent before Christ, to the presence of Christ in them, in the Holy Spirit. And in that way, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, God becomes all in all, not just all over all, but all in all.
So does that, in your view, is that taken to imply some kind of continuity of personal consciousness? Is there a selfness in us where we would be, uh, I guess, aware of our own histories in eternity, or is that kind of bound up with either the gnomic will or some kind of ego self that ultimately
Well, I
passes
mean,
away?
you see, again, the ego in and of itself isn't the fullness of our personality, is it? It
Right,
tends to
right.
be a diminished mode of personality. When it's transcended, we still have our personal identities. I mean, I still think it's like saying, if you cleanse the facets of a prism, do they remain individual? The light in each facet. Well, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But the light that's in them is one light, but they're still individual facets. There's no point in God creating creatures to share in the Trinitarian life, to become, actually, this is the language. People forget just how bold the Greek fathers could be in their language. Iso Christi, equals of Christ, iso thei,
Mm-hmm.
equal to God. But that's actually what the New Testament says. I shall know even as I am known. It doesn't say I'll have a better apprehension. It means I'll actually know myself with God, by God knowing me in himself and knowing himself in me. It's this, I mean, the language of deification, there are many verses, of course, that it draws on. There, the prayers of Christ in Gethsemane, that they may share that they may have that glory that you and I shared before the foundation of the world. The Patrine epistles, that you might become partakers of the divine nature. In John, of course, the Gospel of John, chapter 10, using that language from the Psalms, you are God's, in order to say rather shockingly, it's not scandalous that Jesus calls himself the Son of God, because human beings can be called gods, which is even more shocking, he seems to suggest. But actually, it's a lot of the Pauline language. It's, this passing from glory to glory, this knowing even as we are known, for now seeing only as in a glass darkly, but then face to face. Face to face, remember what this means in the ancient world. I mean, this is equality. Even when he talks about friendship, remember, friendship in the ancient world is understood as a state of a union between equals. To become someone's friend, you have to be raised to that person's level. But face to face, especially looking directly into the face of another, is not actually a privilege you enjoy with your superiors in the ancient world. If he, and you find this language in the Judaism, reaches down and lifts you by the chin and raises your face to his, this is an act of extraordinary grace, right? That very image is used in the New Testament, but in the ancient world, you did not look your master or your brothers face. You did not converse face to face in that sense.
Mm-hmm. So it's actually an elevation and perfection of the self
Yeah.
that goes on in eternity, not the cancellation of the self.
Right. Well, again, what are you identifying the self with? It's definitely the destruction of the false self. This
Old man.
I guess the old man. Well, or the outer man, which, though this is a different issue, which Paul actually equates with flesh and blood. I have to say, I mean, literally flesh and blood, but that's a different issue. That's again, that's a different.
Yeah, it's related because you wrote an article with Notre Dame, one of their websites, about Paul's understanding of the resurrection and Christ taking on a pneumatic body. I found that incredibly helpful. But part of what I'm curious about too then is in this deification of all creation, can that be thought in material terms as we would conceive of materiality, or
well, remember, matter is not a concept for Paul.
Right.
Okay. In one sense, materiality is ubiquitous. Everything other than God has some kind of corporeality. Mm. Angels, demons, gods, that is angels for him, but you know what I mean. Right. for an ancient philosopher who might in the Aristotelian school, which was taken up into Middle and Neoplatonism, there's a clear sense of materia prima, ili proti, as an underlying substrate. But there's some church fathers like Basil and Basil Caesarea and Gregory of Nyssa, who dispense even with the idea of the substrate. They're almost Berkeleyan idealists in the way they talk. But matter, in our sense, the notion of some coarse, ductile, atomic, articulate substance, that's not really the world he's working in. Everything is corporeal for him, other than God.
Yeah, I guess
pure spirit. But he's quite clear. I mean, for Paul, he's quite clear, at least, that flesh and blood are not, that there are forms of material body that are incapable of immortality. They are inherently mortal and decomposable. And I mean, he is a Hellenistic thinker. He's influenced by both Stoicism and a kind of tacit Platonism that was present in everyone's thought.
Right. Because I guess where I'm kind of imagining a crux is on, for 2023, a contemporary Christian who wants to hold out hope for the apokatastasis. Do we need to be worried about the heat death of the universe or something like that? Is that a conflict?
The impact of what? Sorry, one second.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Do we need to be concerned about the impact of what?
Oh, the heat death of the universe or things like that, or is that a category error in thinking?
Well, the heat death of maximum entropy. There's not much we can do about that one way or the other.
Right. Or I just mean, could you simultaneously think apokatastasis and think of a world such as we observe it, that it seems headed in that direction? Is there a conflict there? Or is that a misunderstanding of
Well, I mean, obviously, when these texts talk about the restoration, the apokatastasis ton panton, or again tikkun olam, the healing, they're obviously thinking in terms of a transformation into a different, more spiritual state, a pneumatic or pneummatic state. And again, remember that spirit in this sort of Stoic, quasi-Stoic tradition is not, again, it's not a state of incorporeality. It's a kind of body that's not made up of, it's not composite. It doesn't have to be informed externally by a psyche in the sense of just an animal life principle. I mean, what's often translated as in translations of 1 Corinthians 15, you have mistranslations, a natural body and a spiritual body. That's not what it should be. In my version, it's psychical, just to make the point, but I could have translated it animal, meaning that everything has to go past the state of being merely animated in a composite fashion in the way a mortal being. This is something that for Paul is intrinsically mortal. And that the restoration of all things involves the spiritualization of all things, in which there's no longer a division between life and flesh and blood, say. But I mean, it's unimaginable, obviously. But I mean, the point is just to realize that the eschatology they're assuming, which is also, I mean, it's also full of ambiguities in the New Testament in the early centuries, because, of course, at times it's imagined as a future state, at times it's imagined as a state above, and these things are not strictly discriminated from one another. This is the point I've tried to make about the word aionios in these. Often, actually, what I've said about it gets misrepresented, as I was saying, aionios only has one meaning, that is the age to come, or very long, or that's not what I said. I say that there are all sorts of conceptual distinctions that we make that were not made then, and so it can, aeonius can mean eternal, it can mean for a long time, it can mean having to do with the eternal eon above, the heavenly eon, which is eternal in one sense in that it isn't broken up into temporal partition, but in another sense, all potential is actual there. But it can also mean, very important in Second Temple Judaism and in the early Christian centuries, the age to come, which is, we exist now in the Olam Hazeh, this age, and all eschatological is that either in the future or above or both, somehow in an indistinguishable way, this will be transcended in the state of the Olam Haba. And again, Olam and Eon again can mean world too. That's another meaning. So whatever the case, they're imagining this reality, but in a way that's been freed from death, and I assume the heat death of the universe,
Fair
the
enough.
entropic state.
No, and thanks for allowing the jump. I realize,
Can I return to the matter of nature and grace before I forget, though? Because
I'd love to, and maybe we could roll into the conversation around your the new edition of your translation of the New Testament.
Well, it's relevant to the new translation because, or not the new translation, the new edition. There's a long, there's a tradition. It's again more Western than Eastern, of making a firm distinction between nature and grace and treating this as a Pauline distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that's really contingent on a verse in chapter 11 of Romans, in which Paul uses the metaphor of an olive tree, into which the Gentiles have been grafted, even though they by nature are wild, not cultivated olive trees, or an olive tree, in which he uses the word nature apparently 3 times, physis. And though in my first edition of the translation, I tried to free the text from habitual patterns of translation in order to free it from later, I think, misleading translations that were created by trying to retrofit the text to fit later doctrinal or theological developments.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't always succeed. I thought I had, but even I fell into patterns more than once, which were identified for me by some good critics and also by myself on second or third reading. Well, one of them is in this verse in chapter 11. I had originally just gone with the sort of standard way of saying, "You who were wild by nature, contrary to nature, were grafted into the good olive tree, the cultivated olive tree of Israel," is what he's saying. Mm-hmm. How much more so those who by nature, that is the Jews, belong to this lineage. Well, the funny thing is, of course, is even in making that translation, I knew that Paul's not using the word physis, nature, in the later abstract theological sense, or even in the abstract philosophical sense that was taking root in his time. Nature, really, the physis in Greek, like natura in Latin, primarily means line of descent, origin, the race, the family, the line, the lineage. And all he's saying there is that if he's not making a distinction between nature in the grand later theological sense and grace. For him, grace, charis, is something he invokes, but not as a special principle. It just means God is always generous and loving in his dealings with creatures. He uses charis not as something special. It's just describing the character of God. But when he talks, what he's saying is, if you who by derivation, extraction are wild rather than cultivated. If you come from a wild line, I mean, literally, he's talking about viniculture and agronomy and arboriculture here. He's not talking at all about some notion of nature in a later theological sense. And I had tried contrary to nature. Well, that's not really what paraphysin means, either there or in Romans 1. It means just, para doesn't mean contrary, it means outside of. So it means if you're from outside this line, if you who are outside the proper lineage of Israel or of the good olive tree can be grafted in, how much more so, ... those who by derivation, by lineage belong to it. So now I've retranslated that verse. This is a good example. And some people are not going to like what I did with I say those who by lineage or derivation, I can't remember which, by genealogy or something, are wild olives who have, instead of contrary to nature, I say this with a wince of shame, but actually with pride, exogenously grafted in. How much more those who by pedigree belong, the people of Israel. It makes a huge difference, obviously, because that's the only verse in Paul that's ever been invoked in the tradition to back up this spurious, hard and fast division between nature and grace, which is not a Pauline idea at all. In fact, it couldn't be more contrary to the actual shape of his theology. He just doesn't think in those terms. That's the late Augustine, who was the victim of bad translations, but here just a victim of living in a time when words like physis and natura had been almost entirely conscripted into sort of a more abstract philosophical terminology.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's very helpful. And just as an aside, I know I've heard you say previously that it's not intended for liturgical use, but I'm here to testify I have used it in leading church worship services, and particularly your introduction to John's Gospel, or your translation of it, I think rewilds the text for people in a way that has been really refreshing and edifying. So I hope people check and will consider it.
The high Anglicans I grew up among couldn't do it. I'm sorry, if you're high Anglican, remember style is the thing.
Yeah, right. It's an aesthetic.
Cranmer's prayer book, Coverdale's Psalter, the authorized King James version of the Bible, because if it isn't beautifully phrased, what's the point?
Right. That's fair enough. Well, and so just jumping maybe a step back, I think that's part of what I find so powerful about your work in this translation is that nuance, because on the one hand, you're embracing things like textual and historical criticism in your translation, but at the same time, you're staying deeply rooted in the classical worldview that actually facilitated the development of content.
Yeah, I mean, there really should not be a conflict here. This is the funny thing, is it's only fundamentalists or people who don't know that they're fundamentalists, but are anyway.
Right.
Who seem to think that there should be some great conflict here. Well, the fact is, the early church fathers were, in many respects, often historical critical readers to the degree they could be. I mean, Origen is like, compare the different translations, the different texts available, the scripture to get different. It didn't bother him that there was not a single consistent text.
Right.
And the whole style of exegesis, the whole allegorical spiritual reading tradition, they borrowed and developed it with greater depth from pagan culture, acknowledged that the text itself had a historical origin other than just having been delivered verbatim by the lips of God.
Right.
To some by some oracular means. Augustine even talks about this late in the Confessions, that the actual human author's intentions in the text don't exhaust its meaning. And and when I say people who don't know their fundamental, it's amazing. I've been attacked. I am always attacked by Thomists, I should say, more than any other faction. By Thomists, again, I mean this school that I have done more than my fair share, perhaps, to provoke. But what always amazes me is when they attack me for things that are just perfectly orthodox according to tradition, but they're unaware of because all they know is their system. They really are just like encyclopedically ignorant of the rest of Christian tradition. I've quoted, I've more or less, sort of, if not, how can I put it? Repeated in a somewhat condensed, but in no way misleading form, statements the church fathers make about the character of God as taken literally from a lot of texts in the Old Testament, which, they're free to say that, things are attributed to him that we would not attribute to the worst of human beings. Things are monstrous, right? And that therefore these are the scandals of the text. This is the scandalon of the text, to use Origen's term, which prompts us to a higher reading. And I've had actually Thomists like the redoubtable Edward Fazer and some guy named Taylor O'Neill, acting as if this was the most abominable blasphemy ever uttered, although it's right there in Gregory of Nyssa and other church fathers, and even actually passages in Joseph Ratzinger I could point to. But the point to make here is that the historical critical method, in a way, helps us recover that saner view of the traditional allegorical reading, that it's not, you're not looking for a coded message. I mean, Origen didn't think that, the Isaiah sat down and said, well, how can I encode Jesus secretly into the, that's not what he believed. The assumption that he's working on is that the act of reading isn't inspired, that the scripture is inspired not as a sort of unalterable and or literal portrait of God or the will of God, but in fact as an object of prayerful contemplation by the church, the mind of the church, and of those who are reading in the embrace of the Holy Spirit. Right? This is how he thinks. And again, this saves us from a set of rather horrific notions. Those Thomists I mentioned, Ed Fazer, was quite happy to say, yes, no, it is a just portrait of God, that God did order the slaughter of whole peoples, down to the last babe in arms, down to the cattle and the kine, and that this is good. And he was able to do this not because he's beyond good and evil, but because he's infinitely better than we are. Again, as I say, Thomism is a psychopathology, and it's sad. I mean, it really is the damage it does to minds and souls, and the idiotic things it makes people say. It's not. And I was again the O'Neill fellow. Again, it turns out that there is a formidable strain of biblical fundamentalism in this circle. He said that the actual historical contents of the Bible can't be doubted without doubting the veracity of the whole. Therefore, it would be a problem if one of the Gospels said that Jesus went into this region at this time, and it turned out not to be true. But of course, we know. God love them. I mean, about Thomas. They've never actually read the Bible, so they're unaware of a lot of these problems. But we know that the historical data, even of the Gospels, contradict one another. I mean, Matthew and Luke give us two completely different dates
Yes.
and the birth of Christ, two different that are irreconcilable. John gives us the cleansing of the temple at the beginning of a 3-year ministry rather than at the end of a 1-year ministry. We're just, these cannot be. Paul contradicts Acts when he talks about how he first went to Jerusalem. These are not historically trustworthy documents. That's not the point of them. Well, you can see I'm ranting about all sorts of things, but the point I did want to make is that there's no conflict between the historical critical method. In fact, it should be welcomed, it should be embraced. Those who perfected it often don't understand the ancient practice of reading, so they too think that there's some conflict between what they're doing and say what Origen was doing. But we needn't be bound to the naivetes of either side. I find it absolutely fascinating. I do think that if you have a kind of weak and fundamentalist sort of approach to faith, that is, that you really do require literal consistency and also total consistency of church teaching from the beginning, then it is going to have a somewhat challenging effect on your faith. I mean, if you really understand, say, that Paul did not have a Chalcedonian Christology, that the questions that led to Chalcedon hadn't been raised yet, but that the way he thought about Jesus was not the way later church doctrine thought about Jesus, it can be sobering or it can be troubling, but it needn't be,
Do you think, though, that there is a more difficult challenge with, I guess, the reality, if we can use that as a word, or historical nature of events that might be more central to the Christian story? I have in mind here, something like the virgin birth or Jesus' ascension.
I'm afraid I have to say it's a matter of prudence. I mean, at the one time, you shouldn't surrender just to the modern prejudice that extraordinary things don't happen.
Right. Well, I think at least for the ascension, though, or maybe another is, Paul's conception of Jesus' material body.
Well, I mean, I don't. For instance, there's no evidence that Paul had ever heard of the empty tomb.
Right. Exactly. Right.
And if you follow Paul very carefully, you see there's not a real huge distinction between resurrection and ascension. Through the heavenly spheres to the Father, that the two concepts merge with him, and that in other places they're very different concepts. Mark, the only time it talks about the resurrection, speaks of it as something that's already happened for the patriarchs, because for Mark, resurrection just seems to mean life after death, that a lot of the things that we think that later tradition contracts into specific forms, like, a lot of the term resurrectio carnis, resurrection of the flesh, becomes part of Catholic tradition. The problem is Paul would have abominated the idea flesh can't be resurrected. And so you get these ridiculous, when Paul says flesh, sarx, he means sinful nature. No. He's quite explicit what he means. He's talking about the physical constitution of the resurrection body. And whenever he uses flesh, that's what he means. Also, when he talks about the outer man, he means the fleshly body is striving against the inner man, which is the spiritual self. I'm sorry, but whether we like it or not, Paul is a first century Hellenistic, some quasi-Platonic, quasi-Stoic Jew, and that's good.
Yeah,
it was, that was the Judaism of the time, and it was Greco-Roman antiquity.
So I guess
but what do you do with that then? Yeah. Things like the resurrection, the empty tomb narratives obviously conflict with one another. So, there's no reason to imagine that everyone alive in the early church had the same conception of what had happened, or that everybody agreed on what had happened. What they did know, and this is what makes the first part of 1 Corinthians 15 so illuminating, is that there had been real, vivid, life-changing encounters by a huge number of Christ's followers with Christ after his death, the risen Christ, analogous to the one that Paul himself would have, but he hadn't noticed, and that this was so plenteously attested and that and believed that what should have been the defeat of that faction, as the death of false messiahs had been for, say, the death of Theudas and others, mm-hmm. instead was followed by this huge eruption of faith in which people were even willing to die for their conviction that they had encountered the risen Christ. And precisely whether Paul's understanding of the resurrection body or the one that you get at the end of the Gospel of Luke, or the somewhat different one that you get suggested in Acts, which suggests that if Luke was the author of both, even he didn't have a consistent, firm notion, that the experience of the resurrection, of the real presence of the risen Christ, was attested by everybody of whatever their different convictions about what its metaphysical or physical contours might have been. Mm-hmm. But for instance, if you were to ask me, did Paul believe in the empty tomb? I don't know. You'd think he'd have mentioned it when talking about the early. He doesn't mention the women at the tomb. He mentions Christ appearing to Cephas, and then to the 12, and then to all these others, 100 at a time here, and then last to Paul as like one who is late, or not even lately born, actually like an aborted fetus is how he describes himself.
Wow, that really changed.
Yeah, it's an unpleasant image, but like an abortion, the people who want an absolute, and you get this in every. This is not, say, unique to fundamentalist evangelicals or to cradle Catholics or Orthodox. There are a great number of people who believe that what they've signed on for is a system of propositions, and they've been totally consistent and they're entirely understandable. The reality is, if you go back to the beginning of Christianity, the one thing that they shared, and the one thing only, was this extraordinary conviction of the resurrection, in the light of which there was never one single interpretation or account or understanding. There simply wasn't. Paul's understanding is very much inflected through his semi-Stoic, semi-Platonic metaphysics. It's the only metaphysical description of resurrection that we have in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. But it's clearly not what you get at the end of the Gospel of Luke, right? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And how they thought about, the final resurrection. I mean, in John's Gospel, in some sense, it's already happened. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's clear that there's a kind of merging in different places between the notion of ascending above into the heavenly places and the eschatology and some sort of event at the end of time, or the end of history, or the end of one history becoming eternity, or becoming another history. And one and the same author can give evidence of more than one of these different views. I mean, the gospel, that's all I had to say on that. I mean, that's enough to offend people, usually.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and so I have two questions, I guess, out of that. And one, I guess...
Wait. If you really want to scandalize people, there's a book by someone named Father Tirso, Tirso, The Rainbow Body, in which he talks about a phenomenon within one school of Tibetan Buddhism about post-mortem experiences of resurrected, so to speak, or emanated lamas or teachers whose bodies then disappeared, and he tries to suggest that maybe this is what happened to Jesus. Okay. I always think that people should read books like that just in order for the shift in paradigm.
Yeah.
To have, if nothing else, I mean, they're free then to burn the book, just so long as they know what they're burning.
Yeah, exactly. It's already taken hold in a way then. So part of what I'm curious about is, are you, well, and the questions are interrelated, so I'll give them to you both, and then answer how you want, or don't if you don't want to. But are you content to imagine, for instance, the presence of Christ amongst his earliest 500 followers or whatever, as a kind of mystical or liturgical or kind of theurgical presence, or is it something we simply don't have access to? And
no, well, I mean, I believe it was a totally extraordinary experience of a person, of the real personal presence. It's not like, the Skillabakes notion that, everyone, they all got together after they talked about it, and they realized that in some sense he was still alive because of the meaning of it. A sort of Easter becomes salvation through group therapy.
yeah.
No, I believe it really was. I just don't believe that historically it makes sense that what Paul talks. I mean, the Gospels are much later, and the empty tomb narratives there and the other narratives have obviously been filtered through decades of pious belief. In 1 Corinthians 15, that's a very early, I mean, you realize how early that text is, and that's just a straightforward report of what I take to be very credible experience, first of what others had experienced, and then of his own experience. And right. I just find nothing there that I think makes sense if you demystify it.
Right, right.
And certainly the survival of the early community doesn't. Now, what later tradition did with Christianity, that's full of problems, and, but it has both good and bad. But that one experience, that the one who had been crucified really was risen and alive and vindicated by God, and present manifestly, at times physically, though not in a flesh and blood way, but physically nonetheless. No, I think that's the only way to understand it. Otherwise,
right,
the whole thing is nonsense.
Yeah, because what I had in mind was something like spiritual perception, as Sarah Coakley or those types of people.
Well, no, I mean, it might be that not every. I mean, it might be that
you had to be trained in it.
That it's not like the same way. It's not an objective phenomenon the way. But is there such a thing as an objective phenomenon?
Right.
Because everything is affected through the sensibility, through the senses, through the interpretation. It's like the Owen Barfield in Saving the Appearances talking about the rainbow. Well, the rainbow is real, but it's not there in the physical sense that an actual colored strip has been drawn across the heaven. It's quite real, but you can't separate the event of its manifestation from the event of its perception.
Right.
And there may be spiritual senses only that, it could be that, it's not like, oh, Elvis really is alive. I saw him I saw him at a diner outside Memphis, which, by the way, has happened to me several times.
Well attested. Yeah.
Well, if I were going to believe that a dead rock legend were still alive, it would probably be John Lennon. It's more
fair enough. Yeah. So this is helpful, because it's part of the question I had previously is how do you set apart the essential from inessential things that need to be maintained? In other words, is there still some role for dogma or orthodoxy with a lowercase o, or because a tradition of apocalypse seems to at least introduce a little tension there. And, at times you've sided with the heretics, and I'm with you on it, but I just am curious, how do you,
well, of course, there's a complicated argument in that book, right? That the orthodoxy that emerged, to the degree that it was a legitimate interpretation, both of what had been in light of this implicit antecedent finality, this notion of belief in deification, or just basically, again, 1 Corinthians 15, that God will be all in all. And this involves the transfiguration of all things, the apocastasis, is not arbitrary. That, Nicaea is actually legitimate. But I will admit that I no longer have much use for the organs of authority.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this isn't as odd as it seems from an Eastern perspective. I mean, people who don't understand, they tend, and this is true in a lot of American former evangelicals who've become Orthodox, seem to think that they know something that actually the tradition doesn't know about itself. But there isn't a papacy there, so it's not. There's a notion that the seven councils, the councils deliver truths. They deliver them in, however, fairly minimal terms.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are those in the tradition who would like to make it more like Catholicism. Imagine that there's something like the Enchiridion Symbolorum, and they've created a book called the Anchor, or whatever the hell it's called. But it's an arbitrary assemblage of documents. If you look at it, it's well, this local synod is infallibly true, but this one isn't, and we know that because we say so.
Right.
Whereas, of course, in the ancient church, no synod it had to be ratified by a council. And even then, the early councils, no one, it's not like before Nicaea, people thought, well, we need an ecumenical council because we know that will deliver firm and unalterable dogma. That was, the very idea of a council was new.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, all of it should be relativized. Yeah. All of it should be rethought and understood that there is there is an orientation of the tradition towards certain ends, but that also the tradition has also been a set of historical fortuities, accidents, and frankly atrocities,
mm-hmm.
And that one shouldn't feel bound to any of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I got to the point where I don't even care if I mean, to me, there's no funnier word in an argument than heretic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just laugh at it because the more of the history of Christian dogma, and Christian theology, and of not only the accommodations, but the willful and almost cynical minimalism of doctrinal determinations,
mm-hmm.
the more you realize that that's a language for children.
Mm-hmm.
It's meant just to keep them in line. This of course, recently, you may know, one of these Thomists, this young Dominican named Dominic Rooney, whom I know, has been attacking that all shall be so. Well, he hasn't. That's the funny thing. He hasn't actually engaged with the arguments in the book. I don't know if he's read the book or not, but it gives no indication of knowing what it says. So, but he keeps throwing the word heretic around, heresy, which is funny, first of all, because, of course, the doctrine he's referring to is Vatican I, which is from Vatican, which, needless to say, does not actually interest me anyway. I mean, it's like, oh, yeah, not Orthodox Christians are deeply concerned about the findings of Vatican I. But the whole term, it doesn't matter. I mean, the thing is, I just see the use of that word as like a child throwing a tantrum. It's just noise. It's always a sign of ignorance. It's always a sign of a bad argument. And when you get right down to it, anyone who thinks he knows what the Orthodox consensus is can always be shown to be wrong from one position, one angle or another. I'm proudly syncretistic. I don't even care. I'm totally indifferent to the organs of ecclesial authority. I do not believe that they are invested with a special infallibility, special authority. Again, this would be harder for me to say if I were Catholic, but then if I believe this, I wouldn't be Catholic, which I'm not anyway. So what do it makes no never mind.
You sound almost Protestant, David. So
because Protestants have their same canon. They have sola scriptura. They have a theological tradition that in many ways is much narrower than the Catholic theological tradition, because they can't, precisely because they don't have. I mean, what Catholicism has is a huge plurality of schools.
Yeah.
When I make fun of the Thomists, most of the people who write to me appreciatively are Catholics. I get Jesuits, Holy Cross priests, Scotists, Lonerganians, all sorts of other Catholics who hate the Thomists too.
Right.
It's not, there's no consensus ecclesiae of on these issues.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I mean, what I sound is like something far worse than a Protestant. I sound like a syncretist because, as I draw quite happily from all the religions of the world too, in my understanding of that event, the resurrection and the event of deification and all that. So I just that's some people despair of that sort of thinking, but that's simply what I believe to be correct, and also that's what I believe anyway. So I might as well own up to it. I mean, I could hide the fact.
Right.
Now, of course, I may go to hell forever and ever.
Why
the Thomists might be the traditionalist Thomists and the others who hold to the might be right. God might be just a. Actually, no, it can't be true. But yeah,
no, fair enough. Okay, that's helpful. So part of in putting your work in conversation with progressive Protestants who are kind of the main of who's reading the Christian Century, how would you differentiate your approach and what you're doing from something like maybe a Bultmannian or Tillich kind of demythologization?
When I talk about the different view of reality that, say, Paul had from the modern view, I don't assume the modern view is right.
Right.
I really do believe that how we see reality is a matter not of how the objective world impresses us, impresses itself on our passive cognitive capacities. I believe it's a matter of how we perceive it. I believe that these are all symbolic orders that point to realities or fail to point to realities. I don't. Not only am I not interested. Well, Tillich. I mean, to me, Tillich was a joke. I mean, he was just like a fellow who couldn't have made it as a philosopher with his sort of watery middle shelling approach to things. Who wrote these huge vapid books on a religion that he only barely knew anything about. But as for Bultmann, this notion that because the cosmology of the first century was not in agreement with that of the 20th, that therefore you reduce the entire thing to this kind of apocalyptic inner illumination. I mean, it's just the Protestant principle basically reaching its reductio ad absurdum. You already find it in Hegel, of course, that the inwardness of the Protestant religion is superior to Catholicism, or if you had talked about it, orthodoxy, because they still require visible artistic mediation, artworks, veneration, sort of mythological structure, but also because they're profoundly reliant on the aesthetic dimension, whereas Protestantism is superior in that it has transformed this into a sort of more rational inwardness and all that, which, I needless to say, don't take very seriously. And I mean, I take the traditional reading of Hegel that he understood religion in the sense of doctrine and worship and as a Vorstellung, as a representation of a rational truth. That I think for him, Jesus was no more really the Son of God except as a Vorstellung of a rational truth about humanity in its totality than, say, Jerry Lewis. He was just, in fact, I don't think, I mean, that's how inward this inwardness can become, and that's true in Bultmann as well. I mean, Christ is the occasion of something, and so, I mean, I have not much use for that. I'm very much interested in the concrete I do think that things we know about the concrete historical Jesus that actually can be extracted. I don't think the sort of weird agnosticism that says that the Logia traditions in the Synoptic Gospels don't tell us anything. No, they tell us that there was, it was, his ministry was focused on the poor, the oppressed, the abused, the enslaved, or the nearly enslaved, the indebted.
Mm-hmm.
That he definitely had some notion of the kingdom of God as something that inverted the whole hierarchy of power and privilege, so that the poor and the forsaken somehow were truer children of God, and that the logic of empire and or vassally of kings and emperors was something that was profoundly inverted in his teaching, and that he was, a social provocateur. And but I also think that that whole spiritual dimension, the whole realm of encounters with realities outside the supernatural. I don't like to use that word. Let's say the divine breaking in. That is not an existential experience. It's not an inward experience. It really should be understood as real encounters with real spiritual agencies that should take real concrete forms, including artistic and liturgical forms. So,
that's helpful. And so just to pick up, there was another direction I was hoping to go here as well. And you've written, I guess, most popularly in that opinion piece for the New York Times, 3 Cheers for Socialism, on how important that is for your thought. Could you draw a through line for us, if there is one, in your view, between your kind of metaphysical disposition here and this kind of commitment to the historicity of Jesus as a person who was fighting on behalf of the poor and marginalized? And
to me, I don't see how. Well, of course, this is also an issue of translation, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are aspects of the Gospels that couldn't be translated away, so they just had to be swallowed whole. Like Magnificat. You just, my goodness,
mm-hmm.
The Mother of God was a Bolshevist. But an accurate translation of the Sermon on the Mount, of the Lord's Prayer, reveals that even there, most of it's actually a prayer for the impoverished to pray. Mm-hmm. It's really talking about being relieved from debt, from escaping not deliver us from evil, but rescue us from the evil man who's already been described above as someone who strikes you in the face, and that you dare not resist by force. It doesn't say resist not evil. It's just it's a very practical counsel. Don't try to resist the evil man forcibly, because you'll lose.
Mm-hmm.
And the evil man is also the one who who beguiles and cheats you by making all these extravagant oaths, swearing by God's throne, swearing by the holy city. So he's trying to convince you of what an honest fellow is. And Jesus says, it's not anything beyond that comes from evil or from the evil one. He means literally anything more. These extravagant oaths, that's oaths. They come from this rogue who wants mm-hmm. to cheat you. And remember, take you for everything you have, then you can be enslaved. Or when you're being taken to court, make peace with the plaintiff, not because the plaintiff has the just case, and not because Christ is just recommending universal amity, but precisely so that you're not handed over to the bailiff, thrown in jail, and robbed by a corrupt legal system and a powerful man. His whole ministry coming out of the Galilee into Judea is just soaked with social provocation and absolute condemnations of great personal wealth. I mean, this is absolutely clear What did you come into the wilderness to see? A reed shaken by the wind, men dressed in fine clothing, well, in soft garments. You'll find them in the palaces. Here you came to find the righteousness of God, right? He literally means that if you're very rich, you have a camel's chance of getting through a needle's eye to be a proper citizen of the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom that's coming, this inversion of the order. There's just no question. And lending and interest is not just bad, but those who enclose, those who join estate to estate, everything, every political and social abuse of power is condemned, meaning that political and social remedies are being recommended too, not just personal remedies. You don't condemn an institution to say, but don't worry about it. You just try to be a good fellow. That's not what he was clearly a provocative and revolutionary figure in some sense, and the cleansing in Jerusalem precipitated his execution because it was an act of rebellion against those in power in the temple and in the society at large, which just kept profiting off the poor, making them I just to me it's absurd to suggest that you can have any actual devotion to who Jesus of Nazareth was and embrace laissez-faire capitalism or the entrepreneurial principle or the iron wall of wages, or the notion that we should be erecting a border wall and keeping out asylum seekers, or that nationalism is a good thing. And as we know right now, these people who call themselves Christian national, well, not Christian, I mean, what is it, national conservatism, right? Consider themselves Christians, these sort of people who love Viktor Orban and Giorgia Meloni. These are not Christians. They simply are. They have. There's nothing about their vision of reality and their vision of their relations to their fellow human beings that bears the slightest resemblance to who and what Christ was and what he taught. Yeah. And so I don't care if they're Baptists, I'm free to say that ideologically, intellectually, socially, politically, morally, they are not in any way related to this one, the Jesus of Nazareth. Now, there were, the Christian socialist tradition is a very honorable and old tradition, and in England, especially, there are French and German variants and others, but the English and then Anglophone versions weren't even left-wing, really. I mean, John Ruskin is my favorite figure in this tradition, and he was a monarchist, Tory. He associated liberalism in the Millian sense with liberal capitalism, what we call neoliberalism now. And he preferred a sort of enlightened monarchical parliamentary system in which we viewed ourselves as all belonging to one human family, with the sort of symbolic head of state who's not part of any political party and therefore is concerned only with the public weal. But however you understand this, I mean, to me, the Christian socialist tradition is just an actual attempt to translate the teachings of Christ into a social and political vision in the post-industrial or industrial and post-industrial age. It's just, to me, it's almost analytically obviously true, and that there's simply no place within the Christian vision of reality for, there's a place for kind of, and don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about conservative and liberal in the American sense. There are kinds of culture. I'm sort of culturally conservative on a lot of things. Like, I think children should be taught Shakespeare in school, and they should be taught taught Greek and Latin. Damn it, and Hebrew too. I mean, I'm for all of it, but But I do believe that this isn't even a meaning. There's not even a meaningful debate to be held on this. The Christian right is the anti-Christian right. Basically, the Christian right is a movement whose ultimate ends is the extinction is to extinguish real Christian convictions in society.
That's great. So that's kind of the end of my linear questions. I wonder if, with the time we have left, could we do kind of a rapid fire, and I'll give you.
Yeah, we'll have to make it rapid. Yeah, so go.
And you could give yes, no, or quick answers if you want, but these are mostly from readers who ask, what do they most want to know from you? The first was, do you consider yourself part of the radical orthodoxy movement?
Sure. I mean, they're all friends of mine. I wasn't there when the charter was drawn up, but I'm a fellow traveler, I guess. But I prefer to think that they're following me. But okay.
Fair enough. Are you hopeful or more pessimistic about the field of theology as an academic discipline?
Very pessimistic. I think it should be abolished.
Fair enough. What do you view as the greatest philosophical challenge to Christian faith today? That's probably hard to do in rapid fire, but.
Well, I mean, I think the greatest philosophical challenge is the philosophical incoherence of a lot of traditional Christianity, say in the doctrine of hell, which obviously is an abominable nonsense, but that is, So I would say the greatest or as the Christian right, again, the people, people who think, Jesus was a great lover of the Second Amendment and a hater of Mexicans. So I would say the greatest philosophical challenge is that Christianity, both in its theological traditions and in its historical embodiments at different times and places, is philosophically incoherent at a radical level, and much of it is self-evidently false.
Yeah, that's great. Last one, do you think of yourself as a mystic?
No.
Fair enough.
Now, my dog is, but I'm not.
Yeah. It was good to hear Roland's voice for a second. I hope everyone knows.
Yeah, he was there. Yeah, he actually is a talking dog, I should point out. You heard him barking, but he actually, I don't mean Roland in Moonlight, I may somewhat exaggerate his eloquence, but he is one of those mimic dogs who mimics human phrases with uncanny accuracy and uses them in the correct settings. And I mean, he has a whole repertoire of them. That's how he became the talking dog of the book and of those columns, because he really does wake me up every morning by coming in and saying, "How are you?" This is. Sometimes the Y isn't exact; it comes out "woo." How are woo? But I mean, he lit and hello. I want food.
Yeah.
Mama, that's one of his favorites. I mean, he's really devoted to my wife, and I mean, and like 24 phrases that he has uncannily good. What I find fascinating about it, though, is he doesn't use them arbitrarily. Like, he only says "How are you" when he's greeting someone. For instance, he knows it as a greeting, so it has a semantic content to him in some sense. But there you heard him barking at the postman, or postwoman as it happens, who had the effrontery to leave a package on the porch.
Fair enough. That's great. Well, to close this out here real quick, or I guess the penultimate phrase, I know you're working on a book on the philosophy of mind. We talked about the new edition of your translation of the New Testament coming out with Yale in March. What else should we be looking out for from you?
Well, there's more fiction forthcoming. There's a collection of short stories. My son and I are writing a sequel to our children's book of The Mystery of Castle Maccarella, which is, I think you'll admit, second only to War and Peace in the Western novelistic tradition. And yeah, we're almost finished its sequel, The Mystery of the Green Star.
Wonderful. Well, we will invite everyone to check those out and to buy lots of copies.
And of course, collections of essays. And I don't know, they're just always books and books.
Yeah, very good. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hopefully working with you again in the future, and we'll wish you well for now.
Okay. Take care.